You're listening to the Omni Athlete Podcast, your source of peak performance techniques and actionable practices from the world's highest achieving mind, body, and spirit competitors. Join host Rich Walkoff, longtime NFL sportscaster for the San Francisco 49ers, on a journey to access your peak performance state and unlock sport as a transformational human experience. Welcome to Omni Athlete. Hey guys. Welcome to Omni Athlete. You guys are here because you know that anyone can access their peak performance state through sport. But knowing about peak performance is not the same as actually achieving it. The reason why we created this show and company is to connect you to the athletes, coaches, and performers who will actually show you how to achieve your peak performance state. Today's guest is a former first-team All-American and NFL linebacker from the University of Wisconsin, who's passionately determined to unweave the outdated and scientifically disproven notion that repetitive head trauma, often just the toll necessary to achieve success as a football player, does not lead to CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. While he never intended to become the face of a growing movement to liberate former, current, and prospective football players from the shackles of this debilitating and quite honestly absurd narrative, his retirement from the NFL after just 1 year of playing, a year that saw him named NFC Defensive Player of the Week and Defensive Rookie of the Month, sure signs of a potentially lucrative and celebrated career playing for one of the league's most storied franchises, prompted many in the media to anoint him bearer of football's soon-to-come fate. Since his retirement, he's been called the most dangerous man in football by ESPN and asked to paint the picture of where he sees America's most beloved sport going on shows like CBS This Morning, Outside the Lines, and others. Although it's easy to perceive his actions post-retirement as attacks on football in the NFL, like his teaming up with the Union of Concerned Scientists to become a science champion for truth, which has been dubbed a blast against the NFL by New York Times and USA Today. The truth behind his energy, passion, and motivation goes far deeper than the NFL, football, or even sport. Through his work with organizations like Dr. Richie Davidson's Center for Healthy Minds, the University of Wisconsin, he is on a mission to pull back the shadows of the human brain and what happens to athletes neurologically as a result of high-level competition, performance, injury, and ultimately retirement. And he wants to go even further. It's not enough to just know the risks are inherent with competing in sport, like football, where repetitive head trauma is par for the course. Through the creation of his own organization aimed at bringing mindfulness and meditation practices to collegiate athletic programs across the country, this former NFL player turned entrepreneur aims to arm the next generation of athletes with the tools they need cognitively to manage their stress, anxiety, injury, and rigors of high-level competition, as well as empower them with a process for going inside, listening to their intuition, and developing a framework for making the tough decisions that they face on a daily, monthly, and yearly basis. Like what their health will be if they continue down this road. It's not anger or vitriol that drives it, but the belief that science and the truth should never take a backseat to entertainment or profits. So guys, without further ado, please help me welcome to Omni Athlete the 2013 Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year and the man who intends to bring mindfulness, meditation, and athlete transition into the mainstream consciousness of high-level athletes, Chris Borland.
Well, when we say one and done, we normally think of college basketball players having 1 year on campus and then jumping to the NBA, and a lot of people are upset about that. You had your own version of one and done that is most unique and maybe historic in many respects. So, Chris, you walk away from the National Football League after a sterling rookie year with the 49ers. Much has been said about it, but in your own words, what prompted you at the age of 24 to walk away from such a promising career in the NFL?
Well, I think in 2 words, brain damage. Obviously, there's a lot more that went into it. I'd had a concussion history, played for 10 years, and other than the 2 diagnosed concussions I had in clinical evaluation, it was determined I had 13 of that severity. So quite the history. And then combined with the research that was coming out at Boston University, at the University of Michigan, at UCLA, I did a lot of research and talked to a lot of doctors and researchers and decided for my goals in the game, compared with my past experience, compared with the numbers that were available that were reflecting former players, just decided to choose on another career path. I think at the time was naive to how white hot this issue was, but whether I had a good first year and was in line to be a starter, or whether I was a marginal guy, didn't really factor into my decision. It was just about my health.
Right. And you became a lightning rod in many ways because of the recent revelations about CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that has afflicted so many former players, and the fear and belief that many current players are likely to come down with this brain disease that is so traumatic, so literally in the name itself. So tell me, who you consulted, or did you confide in anybody to make this decision? Teammates, parents, coaches, whomever?
Well, it was a unique year because there's a cliche in sports and in football that you don't want to be a distraction. And while I was looking into this, literally reading things in private while in the locker room at times, felt that I couldn't put it on any of my teammates, at least the guys who were playing. So I really only confided within the football world, at least initially, with two teammates who were on the practice squad. One guy was on IR and one guy, likely wasn't going to play. So towards the end of the year, I mentioned to them, hey, I've been looking into this, read a lot on it, and I'm concerned, and didn't really know that I'd walk away after 1 year for certain until I'd say the end of December. Those guys were somewhat understanding. They hadn't looked into it in depth, but I never did tell any of my fellow players who were playing, or certainly anybody on staff, just because, I'd be like, revealing company secrets if you were talking about CTE to people whose job it was to play football on a weekly basis. So I kept it to myself.
Well, as a member of the 49er radio broadcast team for over 20 years, I was right in that locker room. And I remember when League of Denial came out, and I went talking to players on your roster, on your teammates, about the risks, about their concerns. And most of them said, we know the risks, we accept them, and it's a given, but we're going to live with that. You had a very different view. Had you shared that insight that you had, there may have been undue backlash, or there may have been some people who wouldn't have accepted your decision as graciously as maybe you would have hoped. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think you hear that a lot, particularly in the last couple of years, that players know what they're getting themselves into. It would be interesting to hear a series of follow-up questions, because I've listened and read and heard players say that exact thing, and very rarely is the subsequent question asked of, well, can you quantify it, or what specifically have you looked into? Because I think a lot of these players, even the ones who believe they're informed, may be getting their information from sources, such as the league or PA. And what I've found is that the information out there is far more damning than those sources provide. So I was reluctant to speak out on it initially. After I made my decision, it became clear that I was tied to this, perhaps for life, and have used that platform to speak out on it and to vouch for the experience of not only former players, but their families. Just came from a film screening in Chicago of a documentary that's just premiered called Requiem for a Running Back. It's a great film, and I think what makes it so powerful is it's the voice of a daughter of a player who, along with her sisters and her mother, essentially became caregivers for their father and husband. That's a voice we don't often hear. I think this issue is framed as, do you regret playing as a former player? And I think most guys, even guys with ALS, say they don't. It may be a different equation if you ask their loved ones.
I'll be very honest and frank. I have such a love-hate with the game of football. I watched it forever. I never played it, but being intimately involved with the 49ers and the Raiders for a number of years, for 30 years, sideline reporter for 13 years during the heyday, Joe Montana and Ronnie Lott, Steve Young and Roger Craig and all those, Jerry Rice and all those great players. Up close and personal, I saw it, and I have such a marvel at the intensity, the discipline, the performance under pressure like that, as you, I'm sure, got in your blood and your soul and your DNA. But then to walk away with the newfound knowledge, that must have been a very, very difficult thing to do. How conflicted were you?
Well, I was extremely conflicted and still am. You articulated beautifully the incredible game that is football. Extremely violent, but it's like ballet in spite of the violence. To see a receiver go over the middle and avoid contact and catch the ball with one hand, and then the footwork and the pass rush and the timing. And I love football. And to come to terms with the insidious nature of CTE, in spite of my love for the game, is excruciating even to today. So, I know a lot of people deal with that love-hate relationship. I actually empathize with fans because I got to play at that level and I know what it's like. So some of the sparkle wears off when you see how the sausage is made, to mix metaphors there. But, I think if you've never played, perhaps you hold it on a pedestal, and to deal with some of the stories that you hear as a fan, I imagine it's very difficult not knowing what the game's like. But I'm in a good place with it. I'm happy to see that there's some kind of a grassroots effort to do things in order to help former players. It's frustrating, I think, at times the NFL and the PA and others. It's more about public relations than it is about substantive help for former players. But it's been really great for me to be involved in positive efforts to help. I think the landscape's getting better. I don't think that football can or ever will be played entirely safely, but awareness is certainly high. And I think we've seen a number of guys take their health into their own hands, which is promising.
Right. I mean, you point out in earlier interviews that football is intrinsically, inherently dangerous, yet Roger Goodell comes out and says, football has never been safer. Well, the subsequent follow-up to that would be safer than what? Safer than it was when you wore leather helmets with no face masks? I mean, guys are bigger, faster, stronger. The pure physics of it would tell you, even though they're outlawing, the defense hits on defenseless receivers or protecting quarterbacks, it may be more dangerous than ever.
Yeah, I think I mentioned public relations. Safer than ever is a not so clever euphemism for dangerous. Hitting yourself in the head with a hammer has never been safer. Is it safe? No. So I think, he's doing his job, and I don't spend time or energy criticizing Goodell because there's 1,000 people that would line up to utter these vague platitudes about the game in order to collect a $50 million paycheck. So it's a waste of time to criticize Goodell, in my opinion. I think the owners could do more. And then I think in the youth level, this often gets cast as an NFL issue. And the thing is that when guys show up day one of the NFL, they've oftentimes incurred as many as 8,000 to 12,000 hits to the head. So if we can minimize that by waiting until high school, adopt the same type of contact rules the NFLPA bargained for in 2011 CBA for the high school and college athletes, and then to ensure and pay college athletes, because this is CTE is a dose response disease, and it's as simple as the more you get hit in the head, the worse off you're going to be. So minimizing that is promising. I don't think having a blue tent on the sidelines that guys go into to be evaluated. I don't think having X amount of medical professionals on the sidelines is effective. Just hit yourself in the head less. However we can do that, that's the best thing for the viability of the game.
Well, with a $12 billion industry on the ropes, if you will, for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the health aspect of it, they were talking about and implementing some new so-called safer helmets. But it's not just the helmet-to-helmet hit, as you well know, is just a centrifugal force of any contact from player to player with the brain sloshing in the skull cavity and whacking up against the skull is going to precipitate the likelihood of CTE. And when 110 of 111 brains are posthumously examined at the Boston University School of Medicine, discovered that they have evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I mean, those are frightening statistics. That's got to send shockwaves through NFL headquarters in the most dire way.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned helmets, and I think that's an important point you made, that the issue is the brain within the skull. Helmets protect from skull fractures or lacerations, but a brain injury is going to happen whether or not you have a $300 helmet on. So I'm yet to see a helmet that removes inertia from the laws of physics. Once they are able to do that, then maybe they might be able to stop brain injury. But these helmets are not better, and they may be worse because they provide a false sense of security. They weigh more. They retain heat. So the helmets aren't something to believe in. I think the NFL is definitely, I don't know if they're on the ropes. There'll never be a talent shortage for NFL players. I think it's more commentary on class and race than it would be on safety. I do, like I said earlier, there are ways to minimize hits, and I think that's the best case. And then just coming to terms with the fact that it's the nature of the game. So 110 out of 111 brains, it's awfully damning. It should be noted that it's a biased sample, but even for a biased sample, that's overwhelming. Interestingly, too, in 2015, the Mayo Clinic did a study where a third of amateur athletes in contact sports had CTE pathology, compared to the control group of 198 brains where zero had CTE, not a single one out of 198. So I think that speaks to causality. NFL and NCAA funded doctors are still incredulous about what causes this. That study alone should speak to causality.
Yes, and when you said about race and class, Dr. Harry Edwards, the renowned sociologist from Cal Berkeley, who has been a longtime advisor to the 49ers, a guy I know very well through the years, said to me on the sideline of practice a few years ago, he thinks because of the preponderance of CTE and concussion injuries and the like, that the NFL in the next 5 or 10 years will be 90+% African American, because only the underclass, the parents of the underclass, will allow their children, their sons, to play in a game that middle class, more often white moms would not. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Dr. Edwards is exactly right, and I think it's already happening. Malcolm Gladwell has written and talked about this. We've seen a youth league in Evanston, Illinois, which is a prosperous suburb of Chicago, already shut down. Other leagues are springing up, like the Snoop Dogg League and others that actually promote the violence, which I think is especially perverse. But I think, like boxing, once we better understand the risks, more and more it will be poor and disadvantaged people that participate in order to get out of poverty. And frankly, I've had teammates from other teams, other players also share this with me, say they would have made the decision I made had they had other opportunities or come from a stable background. But I think there's active players that understand full well that they're the meal ticket for a dozen people out of poverty, and are prepared to take on whatever comes from a long career in the NFL in order to alleviate their family from that stress. So I think it's already happening, and I think it'll continue to trend in that direction as more science comes out about football and brain damage.
Yes, and Harry Edwards went on to say that it was not only because of the poverty, but the danger in the inner city is maybe greater than on the football field. So if you have potentially a lotto ticket or a ticket out, knowing the risks of football, it's one you're willing to accept, because life on the streets in the inner city of most American urban centers is horribly violent.
You're right. And I think as it stands today, you may be better off taking a few hundred hits to the head throughout the fall, from 3 to 5, if you live in the ghetto, rather than being on the street from 3 to 5 p.m. every day. That's why I think at the state and national level, there should be some legislature in order to make kids wait. So if we can retool these youth leagues into flag leagues, which seems like that's already happening. I know Drew Brees is behind it. The great return man from the Browns, Josh Cribbs, is also making an effort. That's a silver lining in the issue of head injury in football. If you were to give me a talented 8-year-old boy and say, get him to the NFL, one of the last things I would do is sign him up for youth tackle. For me, it's essentially whichever kid hits puberty first, runs around or runs everybody over. It really isn't the game in its purest sense. Football is a game that requires explosion, it requires players to be mature muscularly. So I think if we can encourage kids to play a wide variety of sports, develop athleticism, and protect their brain, once you get into high school, we can have conversations about playing tackle.
Sure. I have two sons, one of whom was a very tough little dude. And when he was playing Pop Warner football at about 11, and this goes back almost 15 years ago, he suffered a concussion. And he told me yesterday, because I was mentioning that I was going to be talking with you and about this topic. And he said, Dad, when I got hit, I was knocked out. And I didn't quite recollect the fact that I wasn't there at the game that day. And that we took him to a doctor, and the doctor said, don't let him put the helmet back on until he was asymptomatic. And he was only, like I say, about 11 years old. A month later, he said he was fine. He went back out, and he suffered another, this time less severe concussion. But we took the helmet away for good, and that's it. He switched to rugby, never had any other head injuries. He couldn't walk the next day after a rugby match, but at least we didn't have the concern that he would be potentially dealing with something horrific in a brain injury. And we see Pop Warner attendance and participation down. We see high school football programs folding. Now, some schools and some youth sports programs are making accommodations. You talk about maybe the see what you hit, head up, or flag football and the like. Are they trying to navigate effectively, or is it just fighting a losing battle? Because as we acknowledged at the outset, this game is intrinsically violent, and there's no way to legislate the violence out of it without changing it too dramatically.
Yeah, I would say the heads up stuff, at the very best, it would make it marginally safer, but I don't think it's a worthwhile program. I hear a lot of doctors and researchers talk about heads up tackling. Between my freshman year at Wisconsin and my rookie year with the 49ers, I made about 700 tackles. There's no way to do it safely. And I think it's kind of passing the buck to kids. If you go to a driving range or a basketball game or a tennis court, how many kids hit the ball like Tiger Woods or shoot like Steph Curry or have Roger Federer's one-hand backhand? Those are, doing something correctly at 5 years old in terms of athletic form is very difficult. And that's with an activity that only involves you. There's 1,000 more variables when there's 21 other guys on the field, when the running back's trying to make you miss, when you're being blocked, when you're coming from angles. So I don't believe for one moment the heads up approach to making the game safer. It may prevent a few broken necks, but the brain's still going to slosh within inside the skull.
Sure.
Yeah, I think flag until high school is a great thing. It'll prevent injuries. It'll develop better cardiovascular health. I don't think. Again, I often hear NCAA and NFL funded doctors, one of which I was on a panel with after that film this past Saturday, say we need youth tackle to combat obesity.
Wow.
Yeah. Football is quite literally the only team sport where morbid obesity is a distinct advantage. It's the only sport where if you're a big kid, you can be productive and play. There's great youth football players that can't get up and down the court in basketball and can't play soccer, but they excel at football. So I think youth tackle football is counterproductive to cardiovascular health for kids. That said, I think waiting until high school to play tackle, no off-season contact. In Ohio, where I'm from, that's a rule. So our coach would take us out of state so we could hit and get tougher in Kentucky. And then just adopting the same one contact a week rules that the NFL has.
Yeah, I remember the old two-a-days, and there was a lot of heavy hitting. But Bill Walsh, who was, of course, the iconic late Hall of Fame coach of the 49ers, would back off of that. There was very little contact during the week with full padded practices and the like because he wanted the team fresh for game day on Sunday. But the old paradigm was you have a doctor, a trainer, all paid by the team, whose priority was to get that football player back on the field to win the game, to take the trophy and the glory. The NFL did allow or has now implemented the independent neurological observer on the sideline. You're smiling or smirking. I don't know. You tell me what you make of that.
The moment you're hired by the NFL, you're not an independent anything. I know a few of those guys, and independent in the fact that they're not on the payroll of the team, but not an independent neurologist. And again, I haven't really watched football, but I follow the Concussion Legacy Foundation and know Chris Nowinski well. They're associated with Boston University's Brain Bank. And, almost daily I'll see Chris post a story about a player that they missed, that was concussed and put back into the game. It happens every Sunday. If they're touting having an independent neurologist, the men and women doing it sure aren't doing their job very well, because this happens almost weekly. I don't believe that it's an effective approach to curbing brain damage in football.
Football is the ultimate warrior game, and there are many tribal kind of associations with the game. The team colors, the camaraderie, the fans cheering on their warriors. And when you're hurt, what's the old distinction between being in pain and being hurt, right? And you have a guy next to you who is playing through pain, and one player may have to turn and say, I can't do this anymore, or I'm going to shut it down. You are challenging the machismo of the culture. So for you had to be very brave to step aside. I'm curious about more of the feedback you got, more of the reaction among your fellow tribal warriors when you announced in the offseason after your rookie year at the age of 24, you're done. I won't do this anymore.
Well, I'm sure, as you can imagine, and you may know, that there was plenty of response that was disparaging to my manhood, I guess I could say. That's all right. I expect that. There's cavemen in every locker room. I will say the reaction from within the game was more understanding. Even if guys disagreed, at least viscerally and with their experience, they know what it feels like. So a common response was, I disagree, but I understand and do what you feel is right. For people that haven't played, I think they're completely baffled by it. They don't understand what it feels like to wake up on Monday in November during the season. So I've experienced the whole spectrum of reactions. I think ultimately it's hard to deny the science, and it's coming more and more. I feel the cat's out of the bag, and so many academic institutions and individual researchers are looking into this that it's just hard to argue with in any way. And I think we've seen more players walk away. We've seen more and more former greats of the game come out and share their struggles. It's past due to speak about this candidly so people can try to get the help that's available.
Sure. So many alumni days at Candlestick Park in the day for the 49ers looked like the war wounded from, coming back from the veterans camp of battle, literal war battles. And men who were younger than me looked like they were 80 years old at 40 or 50. So, and let me dive into the Jim Harbaugh storyline. Your 1 year was his last year as an NFL coach with the 49ers. Some have reported and believed that he drove the guys in the old paradigm too hard at times, and too much intensity of, well, you went to a training camp with the Ravens when John Harbaugh was coaching, and there was a lot of padded contact drills. And some believe that during the regular season, the guys didn't rush to come back because they didn't feel as though Jim Harbaugh had their back. He pushed them too far. Is that something that is kind of a push-pull that always goes on in a coach and player kind of tug of war of in some respect? Or can you share your insights on what happened during that 49ers season with Harbaugh? Anything that you could bring to light in regards to what I'm saying there?
Yeah, Coach Harbaugh is one of the most intense coaches in the game at any level, and is demanding. There are rules in place, at the NFL, so you can't hit more than once a week, and on. And he followed all the rules. So maybe we went harder than other teams. I never felt that, particularly from coming from a program like Wisconsin, where we our whole strategy and approach was to bludgeon other teams. It felt like a break for me, but I understand how maybe that intensity could wear on veterans, particularly guys with injuries. I didn't feel like that was a huge problem with us in 2014. I think we just weren't executing entirely that well. So, we wound up 8-8 or whatever it was. But I don't think any rift or anything was because of Harbaugh's style or players' reactions to it. That roster was chock full of veterans and guys that understood and had played for Harbaugh for a number of years, understood how to win and get to the big game. So, to me, it wasn't an issue. Coach Harbaugh's had a lot of success with his approach. And if you love the game and love to win, you can't argue with results. And I think there maybe some guys didn't fit in with his style, but not everybody does.
Yeah, it was kind of the perfect storm. Navarro Bowman, trying to come back from the horrible knee injury suffered in the 2013 NFC Championship game in Seattle, did not play your rookie year. A major reason you got an opportunity. Patrick Willis, his fellow all-pro inside linebacker, suffered chronic turf toe injury that eventually forced his retirement at the age of 30. And here you come on like gangbusters, Pro Football Writers Association, all-rookie team, and you walk away from the game. All three of you guys were suffering through crazy maladies, and only one guy is still in the game, and that's Navarro Bowman. So once again, true to your comments earlier, it is such a debilitating as well as invigorating experience. And that's that push-pull that I'm sure every athlete, and particularly everybody in the NFL, weighs probably daily.
Yeah, I think particularly once you've invested so much into the game, if you're 30 years old in the NFL, you may be playing tackle football every fall for a quarter century. And conversely, maybe not have developed skills outside of the game. So it's hard to start anew. It's hard to abandon something that you identify with. I think a lot of guys, maybe don't have an identity outside of a football player. And that's difficult psychologically, injuries notwithstanding. I think a lot of guys struggle with that. I know the transition's really difficult. Before, when I knew I'd walk away, I actually read up on that. There's a few great books, and I talked to a few former players that have talked about publicly how hard it is to do just that. And that may be a fear that guys have. Some guys are lost souls, whether or not they're hurt or banged up or have brain damage. It's just, there's that adage that athletes live two lives, athlete and former athlete. And to me, that's not very fulfilling.
Yeah, and the numbers are stark, frightening, and unbelievable that a majority of players, after they end their careers in the NFL, end up either bankrupt, unemployed, or with a variety of health and or psychological problems. So you've got the double whammy. As you point out, your whole being is tied up into your role as an athlete. And suddenly the cheers are gone, the game is gone, the camaraderie, the competition is all gone, and who is ready for that? How's the transition been for you? You made it so dramatic and so early in your career.
Yeah, my exodus from football was unique, obviously. And I just did so much immediately after I left the game that I didn't really have time to sit back and think about those type of things. I would have checked every box you needed to check in order to have a smooth transition. Had my degree, saved money, didn't define myself solely as a football player, had tremendous familial and friend support, and it was still tough. It's just such a profound disequilibrium. August approaches and you've been doing the same thing for 15 years and you're not. You can almost feel it in your bones that you're ready for a season to start. And you're kind of adrift in this monotony of more, a slower pace, more methodical life. I'd grown accustomed to the extreme intensity of a preseason season, followed by just the lull and relaxation of a couple of weeks off before again hitting it hard. And found out, very quickly in my first desk job that it never gets that intense and it never completely stops. So you need to develop a more more consistency. Something I've had to work on, but ultimately have adjusted to well. Not that I had any choice. It was the choice I made to walk away. So it's been fun to learn those lessons, but it hasn't been easy at all times.
Well, you're a very mature guy for 27 years of age, and you're talking 3 years after, or you're not quite 27, but 3 years after you walked away. But it's so ingrained in your psyche and your soul and your being to hit and have that adrenaline and all that intensity and all that excitement, and if suddenly pull the plug, even if it was of your own volition. It's not like someone said, "Oh, you suffered a debilitating injury, you can't play anymore." And you didn't get told you couldn't play. You walked away, but still, there must have been those withdrawal symptoms that you had to work through.
Withdrawal is a great word, and I think football is like a drug. I think there's actually some things we could look at neurologically that would support that. I get down in my stance, on occasion just because I'm nuts. But when I do that, I can feel, I do it sparingly because I can feel those feelings come back. I've been around football a little bit and visiting old staffs and coaches and friends and get that intense itch. So yeah, it's in your blood, and I grew up on it. My dad was a college football player. Every Sunday all growing up, we'd watch the Packers whenever it was available. So it's kind of the heartbeat of my childhood. It's the fabric of a lot of communities. So I don't think those feelings, those wistful feelings, are going anywhere.
Right, kind of the Pavlovian response. You hear the whistle or the crowd would roar, and you want to jump out there. And you played the game with such reckless abandon. You were a missile. I mean, if you lined yourself up, you probably weren't the fastest guy in the 40, or certainly weren't the tallest or whatever. But you were one of the most explosive and instinctive. I love the way you shot the gaps and the traps and made some amazing tackles. 108 tackles in half a rookie season. You're on your way to an amazing career, but you made a decision that I'm sure you're comfortable with, that your health and well-being and a long, good life was more important than the glory and the enjoyment of the game of football.
Yeah, well, thank you for the compliment. I've always felt that there's nothing better to hear from a football player than that he plays the game the right way, which is overstated and cliche. But football is a mentality. Linebacker is a mentality, and I tried to play as hard as I could and have as much fun as possible from high school on through the pros. I've got so many tremendous memories. Football to me is a positive. It may catch up with me down the road, but I'm really glad I played as of right now, and I'd like those positive memories to stay memories.
Sure.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to interject. I don't believe you're a dad. If you had a son or someday have a son, would you allow, encourage, or say no way on football for you, young man?
I don't have a son. I think certainly wait until high school. And then rather than having me talk to him, I would have him talk to a lot of the women that I've met throughout advocacy the past couple of years. You're going to get a really biased discussion with a former player. Absent a few rare cases, most guys, even if they're really struggling, don't regret their career. I would have my son talk to people like Rebecca Carpenter, whose dad, Lou, had stage 4 CTE. Talk to Lindsay Wilbur, my friend, whose dad, John, had a bad case of CTE. Junior Seau's kids. And just if my son can convince them it's worthwhile, then he can play.
Can I switch gears with you? You're a teammate of Colin Kaepernick, who is maybe the most celebrated and vilified player not in the NFL today. Some memories you have of Colin as a teammate and some perspective on what his statement has meant to you in regards to the protests and the kneeling on the national anthem about police activities in the minority communities of America.
Well, yeah, first as a player, obviously Colin's tremendous. Led the team to the Super Bowl, another NFC championship. I went against him every day in practice. He's a hell of a lot better than a lot of guys that are playing today, no doubt. And I think that's part of the reason he's suing the NFL owners for collusion It is absolutely laughable, some of the guys who are playing over Cap. He's tremendous. He's fast. He's got a strong arm, makes good decisions. It was a break sometimes when you go against guys you're playing in regular games versus Cap in practice. So I do think he's been blackballed. In terms of his stance, and of course that's the reason he's been blackballed, I fully support him. I've got two brothers that are active duty military, one of who is in Baghdad right now. They support his right to take the stance he's taken. And I think we shouldn't conflate First Amendment rights with specific positions. Whether or not you disagree with Cap's protesting, what he's doing is one of the most American things one could do. I mean, Kaepernick right now is literally traveling the country, spending over $1 million of his own, teaching young people their constitutional rights. Short of eating apple pie atop the Statue of Liberty, there's nothing. You can't be more American than teaching people their constitutional rights. So I absolutely support him. I think his protest has been kind of co-opted and cast as anti-military. I think a few things about that. One, I think there's some chauvinism involved with the NFL and then its marriage with the military. I think these, 100 by 50-yard flags that drape over the field before every game and flyovers and paid demonstrations by the Department of Defense to have a military presence. I think that's ridiculous. And I don't think that's patriotic. I think that's, that goes far beyond patriotism. Secondly, I think members of the military are not immune to the things that Kaepernick is protesting. Many members of the military are from disenfranchised communities, from communities of poverty, and are minorities, and they experience systematic racism and police brutality and a criminal justice system that is skewed against them. So to say what he's doing is anti-military, I think is a gross simplification and even just flatly incorrect. So I support him. I think it's sad that it's not an anthem protest. It's a police brutality protest, and is protesting systematic racism. So for it to be cast the way it has is unfortunate. I hope he's doing well. I can relate probably, 1/1,000,000th of what he's gone through. And it's something that people shouldn't have to. I mean, being cast in a negative light for taking a positive stand is unfortunate. So I wish him well. I've voiced my support in small ways, and, I believe in what he's doing.
And when President Trump calls those who take a knee or do not stand for the national anthem SOBs, you say to that?
It's funny. The reaction to Cap's protest has been probably the best proof that he needed to protest in the first place. To be called inmates, to be called SOBs, to be called the N-word, which I've read in a Washington Post article recently, that proves the need. That proves that racism is very real. In my time at Wisconsin and briefly with the pros, I've experienced those situations while amongst my black teammates. You get a little bit of different looks when you're with a group of guys from South Florida and northern Wisconsin than you do with if you're in a group of white guys. So I think it's very real. I've got friends who've had negative experiences. Donald Trump is, it's hardly worth a comment. It's unfortunately that he's the leader of the free world, because that's a ridiculous statement.
So it's kind of ironic that Colin Kaepernick, who was so loath to say virtually anything to the media for so long, I remember chastising him in the locker room, saying, it seems as though you'd rather be getting root canal without anesthesia than just simply answering easy questions about how's the team feeling about this game or whatnot. And he was so guarded and so almost reclusive in his dealings with reporters. And then he fast forward 2 years later, and he is carrying the torch for one of the greatest social protests of our time.
Yeah, that's. I was on Dave Zirin's podcast a couple weeks ago, and he asked what Cap was like, and I told Dave he's introverted, he's quiet, he's reserved. For him to speak out it is not disingenuous because for him to get out of his shell, he really believes it. And I'm proud of the stance he's taken. I think, sometimes maybe has done things that I disagree with, but overall, it's an incredible act of courage. Like I said earlier, he's donated a heck of a lot of money and time to people in need. And it's his act and the response to it has really, I think, shown us that, we haven't progressed that much further from Reconstruction, let alone the civil rights movement.
Do you think that teams are divided over these social protests at the national anthem and they're keeping it under wraps? Or do you think there is great solidarity in the NFL among the players for the protests that have become so celebrated and vilified at the same time?
I'd imagine teams are split. I can't say for sure. My experience was that, there's an awful lot of, rural conservative guys on a team, and there's a lot of inner city guys that are more progressive. So I think it may be along, like our election was, it may be along urban and rural, a split there. I wouldn't say the team showing the same sign of unity, whether it's hands together or arms together or all taking a knee, is necessarily a good sign. I think that's organizations' attempt to control and co-opt what Cap and others were trying to accomplish. For one moment you see Jerry Jones on a knee and think that he's empathizes with the plight of some of these guys is laughable. We saw what Bob McNair said. A lot of owners are Trump funders, Woody Johnson and others. So, I imagine it's split, and maybe not as split amongst players as it is between players and management.
To play devil's advocate, some have said if you want to protest police brutality against minorities or mistreatment of those in the inner city of color, do it before or after the anthem, or find a different venue or forum. When you take a knee or sit during a national anthem, it's hard to change the perception of many who cannot disassociate that within their minds being disrespectful to the flag or the military or the country.
I think that's a worthwhile critique. I do disagree with it. However, I think chiefly Colin takes a knee because he was instructed or had a conversation with a Green Beret on how to make his protest peaceful and respectful. So there's one counterpoint to that. Secondly, the anthem wasn't played before games until relatively recently. We certainly didn't have the flags that take up the entire size of the field. The flag isn't even supposed to be displayed laterally like that. Brothers have like a small minor pet peeve about that, being at West Point and being in Baghdad. That's not the proper way to display a flag, nor is the flag shaped like America. The people that say protest on your own time or be respectful, I think those points are lost on them, that, this overzealous patriotism isn't the most respectful thing to a military that suffers 22 suicides daily. A lot of these guys and women don't have their benefits coming back from war or discharged, just live their life with PTSD. So I've got a tremendous amount of respect for my two brothers in the military. That's why I'd like to see war as a last resort. We're in the midst of the longest war in American history. I don't think that's a supportive thing for our military. And I also, at the same time, respect what Cap's done. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think it's military or police brutality. I think both are going on simultaneously.
Sure. And it's a closing gambit. What's next for Chris Borland now that football's in the rearview mirror?
Well, this past summer, I wrapped up a pilot program at the Center for Healthy Minds in Madison with a researcher who's worked with the Dalai Lama, and we're working to get meditation and contemplative practices into athletics. So for current and for former players, a way to control their mind, to focus, be resilient. I don't know if we can go as far right now to say that it can help with traumatic brain injury, but I think there's hope. So I'm thrilled about that project. It wrapped up in July, and we're going to get it into more populations here shortly. And then also have started a company doing similar work in college athletic departments. So staying busy. I'm involved in what I'm passionate about, from sports and from meditation, and the future is exciting.
Yes, indeed. And it was great to catch up with you at the Sports Energy Festival last year at Dominican University. And boy, you are a bright, articulate guy. And if Colin Kaepernick is going to be the poster child, if you will, for a new movement to emancipate the underprivileged in America, maybe you could be the pioneer for making the world a healthier place when it comes to football and head injuries and the like. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today, Chris. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.